Hello, this is Nice Guy Eddie. I'm going to do a series of videos that are a little bit different from my usual fare. Some of you that follow me on Facebook, this is a little bit different territory. This was something that was requested by one of my listeners slash followers, Facebook friends. I've posted a picture of the wall behind me, and this is not what's on camera right now is only a little bit. It goes up a few feet, and obviously, I collect weapons. This is not the extent of my collection. There's actually 4 halberds and a spear on the wall opposite me, as well as a shelf with some smaller pieces. Not everything, makes the wall. There's not room for everything, etc. But this is the bulk of it. Again, there's a few pieces up outside the camera range. But somebody asked if they thought it would be kind of cool if I posted a few videos about some of the weapons that I have. There's some amusing stories behind some of them that I was sharing on Facebook, and somebody said, well, you know what, you should make some videos. So I thought, yeah, okay. There are other folks that make videos like this, and I want to be very clear about what I'm not trying to do here. The Mount Rushmore of this sort of content in my mind is Scholar Gladiatoria, Skaldagrim, Shadiversity, and Lindy Beige. Those guys are awesome. I'm a huge fan of all of them. I've loved their videos for a while, and if you want a really informative, very detailed, in-depth video on medieval history, warfare, martial arts, weaponry, weapon reviews, etc., go to one of their channels. If, on the other hand, you were a little bit interested in hearing about how I got into sword collecting and how some of these pieces came into my collection, you know what? Let's sit back and I'll try not to make these too long or too boring for anybody. So how did I get into it? Same story as a lot of kids from the 80s. I grew up on Star Wars. I grew up on Clash of the Titans. I grew up on Camelot and the Night of the Round Table. Greek mythology, medieval lore and whatnot. Again, Knights of the Round Table stuff in particular, but also Greek mythology was a big influence. Loved the Sword and Sandals movies. Loved the old stuff, the Ray Harryhausen claymation movies. Sinbad and all that. But also like the really cheesy 80s stuff. As a kid, I loved like Dragon Slayer and later on Princess Bride and Willow. These are among some of my favorite movies, especially Princess Bride. Was really interested in medieval history, particularly martial history, warfare, etc. Swords in particular always held a bit of a fascination for me. So yeah, that was basically me as a kid. So how did I get into the collecting of it? It was the summer of 1987. Yeah, weird way to start, but it was in fact the summer of 1987. I was in the 8th grade. And growing up, of course, I always wanted a sword. Who doesn't want a sword, right? Kid of the 80s, I want a sword. But, and this is going to surprise a lot of people, we didn't have the internet at the time, as you know it. We couldn't go on Amazon and buy a sword. And I lived in Connecticut at the time, and in Connecticut in the 1980s, there wasn't a whole lot of stores that you could just go to and buy a sword. Yeah, maybe I can go to the city, but, I can't go to the local mall and buy a sword. Not in the 80s. Not in the 80s. And, of course, my parents were of the you'll poke your eye out generation. So, yeah, that wasn't happening. That wasn't happening. Martial arts were also not as popular and not practiced in the same way they are today. So obviously karate, taekwondo, that sort of thing was popular. But a lot of the weapons work, it wasn't as prominent as it is now. Not there, not in that part of the country anyway. Not where I grew up. So the likelihood of me ever owning a sword, zero, basically. And in the summer of 1987, I had a unique opportunity. My father had been traveling on business in Europe, and in Spain, he met a gentleman at the same company who had a son my age, and they hit it off and kind of agreed to do like an exchange, where I would go over and visit their family in Spain for a month, and then their son would come back to the States with me and spend a month with my family. And it was a great opportunity. I learned Spanish. I was actually thinking of speaking a little bit in this video, but I'm afraid I'm very rusty. That was 30 plus years ago. So I'm very rusty. And I'd butcher it. I do still try to practice it. And again, spend a month in a country, you will learn more than you will 5 years studying it at school. It's that simple, especially if you do it at a young age. Anyway, So I had this opportunity. I was traveling. I was staying with a family in Spain, and towards the end of the first trip, I did this twice in '87 and '88. Um, Towards the end of the first trip, it was time to go to the department store in Madrid and get some gifts for some of my family members and a souvenir for myself. And we're walking through the department store, one of those like old style Macy's stores with like 7 floors, and there's different departments in every store. And I find myself eventually standing in the touristy section, the souvenir section of the store, and up on the wall are a couple, not a huge selection, but a couple of swords. And there was a particular, well, there were the two that stand out in my memory. One was a sword specifically meant for bullfighting. It was the kind of sword that the matador at the end uses to issue the coup de grace to an animal that has basically already 90% bled to death and has been battered all afternoon and is on its last legs. Yeah, my feelings about bullfighting, you kind of get it. But and I did see one, and it was an interesting thing. I guess it was a. I'm glad that I saw it, but yeah, not my thing. And the sword itself is it's a very strange design. It has a weird curvature to it and a very odd handle. It's designed for the singular purpose of killing a half-dead bull. It's not what most people think of when they think of a sword. It looks weird. It would hold weird. It would be used in an unorthodox way for, again, a sword and sandals, Knights of the Round Table kind of kid. The other sword that I saw hanging up on the wall, and this is the bummer of an introductory video, is that it's the only sword I don't still have, but I do have a picture of it. This is not a picture of my sword. This was one that I found earlier today that just happens to be the identical sword. Not an example of a similar sword, but literally the same sword. Now, I'm going to go ahead and put it on the screen. It is a very famous wall hanger, Tizona del Cid. It's one of the 2 El Cid swords. You can see 2 other examples of the El Cid swords here behind me, off to my left and right over my shoulder. It's, whoops, this one here is another example of the sword that I had. This one's a little bit larger. I'll be talking about this one later. But this sword in particular was it was only about 28 inches long. It wasn't a really big sword, and it was a wall hanger. Let's be very clear about this. This was a souvenir. Some people might not be familiar with the difference between weapon and wall hanger. The sword enthusiasts out there rolling their eyes like, we're going to go through this again. Very quickly, for people that were just interested in hearing a little bit about my collection and aren't sword enthusiasts, a weapon, obviously, this is a tool. It is meant for the purpose of harming or killing an opponent. And it is designed with that purpose in mind. Its shape, dimensions, weight, balance, and material are all selected with that purpose in mind. A wall hanger is meant to hang on the wall. It's meant to be decorative. It's a decoration. It's not meant to be functional, and you can't fight with it. Most common characteristics of a wall hanger: no edge. Sometimes there's a point. This one had a point, but no edge. And oh my God, it would hurt like hell to be stabbed with this point, being that there was no edge around it. No edge, bad material, not even the kind of material that would hold an edge or that you could put an edge on. You would just destroy the whole thing trying to even grind it down and put an edge on it. Weight is usually a little bit too heavy, although not always. This sword was quite light, but usually weight is a problem. And then more importantly, balance is a problem, because the blade dimensions were not designed with fighting in mind. They were designed to hang on the wall. So this particular sword, this was the exact sword that I had, right down to the black text, Tizona del Cid, and the 2 red lines going up the blade. The red lines were not as pronounced on the one that I had as I recall. But in any case, yeah, that was the first sword that I ever bought, and that was going to be my souvenir from my trip to Spain, summer of 1987. Now, I was a little bit nervous. I knew my parents, and they'd roll their eyes a bit at it and be like, "That's what you brought back, huh?" So I asked the father of the family that I was staying with if he thought this was a good souvenir for me to get, and he said, "Oh yes, this is a traditional Spanish sword. This is good." And it is the sword of El Cid, one of the 2 famous swords of El Cid. These are, by the way, 2 of the most famous wall hangers in history, I should say. I would go so far as to say the 2 most famous wall hangers in history. If you ever go into like somebody's house and they got some tacky decorations, or everything's a little bit dated and they look like 1970s or whatever, I don't know. I mean, again, who am I to talk? Look behind me, right? All in good fun, guys. But you happen to see two crossed swords on the wall, usually on a plaque that is either shaped like a shield or maybe like that double-headed griffin emblem of, I'm going to guess, Spain. I'm, whatever, a wooden plaque and two crossed swords. There's a very good chance they are Tizona and del Cid. The two El Cid swords. Usually, and if it's not, it's usually Tizona del Cid and a similarly styled weapon. But they're very, and next to Excalibur, I can't imagine two more famous wall hangers. And I think maybe Excalibur is more popular nowadays, and maybe in Europe, in America, and especially historically speaking, the two El Cid swords were famous wall hangers, even for people that didn't collect swords, just wanted a medieval-looking decoration in their house. So, but El Cid was, of course, a legendary Spanish folk hero and an actual historical person as well. So there was a history behind that, and that's the country I was staying in. And in addition, the sword itself was made in Toledo. And Toledo was a city that we had visited while I was there. If you are ever in Spain, if you ever have the opportunity, I have to suggest, highly recommend, spend a day at least in Toledo. Put aside some time for that. It's a gorgeously gorgeous city, lots of museums. It's very well preserved from its medieval roots. The architecture, the art, excellent museums, a lot of fun. And it's a city with a very interesting history. I'm going to gloss over a lot of stuff here, so actual historians out there, don't come after me. I'm simplifying. This is what I took away from my visit to Toledo as I was learning about the history of this area. One, it was a place that for centuries Christians, Jews, and Muslims coexisted peacefully in the same city, in the same geographic area. And this is, of course, throughout a lot of this history, they're fighting wars elsewhere in the world, but they're living in Toledo relatively peacefully. That's not to say Toledo never saw conflict. They did. I'm glossing over some stuff, but that was my takeaway, that the three major Abrahamic religions lived together in peace in this city for centuries. The other thing that Toledo is known for is sword making. In this time period, the science behind making steel was not what it is today. Today, if I want a certain type of steel, I just order an AISI standard or SAE standard of steel. I can get whatever I want. If I want it alloyed a certain way, I can order it that way. We have industries making very specific types of steels and all kinds of alloys, and we know a lot about this nowadays. Now, back then, they did know about alloying steels, but it wasn't the science that it is today. It was more of an art form. And the steel that was being produced in Spain and around Toledo in particular was considered really good steel. Spanish steel was considered really good, particularly for sword making. And so a lot of craftsmen, of course, were drawn to the area. And then as a few made a name for themselves, more came to apprentice under them, et cetera, et cetera. And to this day, Toledo still produces a lot of wall hangers. Still produces swords to this day. I don't know about functional swords. I know that if you buy a wall hanger and it's not made in Pakistan or China, there's a good chance it's made in Toledo, even today. As for functional swords, I haven't really looked. Most of the functional weapons that I've purchased in the last couple of years came from China, Pakistan, or a American company that makes them locally. And you may have the same experience in England or in Europe or wherever you are. Japan, of course, still makes katana. So yeah, take that with a grain of salt. But you can still buy swords made in Toledo today. And they were famous for it in the Middle Ages. And that drives home, this makes the previous point all the more interesting, that Christians, Jews, and Muslims who were fighting wars elsewhere in the world were living together in peace for centuries in a city famous for making weapons. I found that kind of mind-blowing, to be honest, as a kid. That really blew my mind. So that stuck with me to this day. I don't remember much else academically speaking. I could look it up and I could read it and do a refresher. But that's what stuck with me to this day, 34 years later, was that little bit of history. So when I did buy the sword and I brought it home, my parents did roll their eyes, also that's what you brought back. But I could regale them with the history of the city of Toledo where it was made, and of course a little bit about El Cid, who was this Spanish folk hero, and the fact that this was a traditional Spanish sword. And so from that point of view, it was a good souvenir to bring back, and it was the first sword I ever bought. Now, why don't I have it anymore? I did mention it was a wall hanger. That's not a problem. Actually, about half of what's hanging behind me is semi-functional or functional, and half of it is decorative and strictly wall hangers. This one I'd had for a long time. The hilt, the actual grip on the hilt, was a piece of wood that was wrapped in cord. Cord meaning over glorified string, but it was a piece of wood, and the ends of it were wearing down. So when I bought it, the cross guard and the pommel, which was screwed on, another thing with wall hangers, the pommels tend to be screwed on. Functional sword, you want it really well, you want it to be peened. We'll talk about that when I actually get into some of the functional pieces that I have, and I can show you what I'm talking about. But basically, the pommel was straight. Well, over the years, as it started to wear down, and if you wanted to tighten it up, it started to get crooked, and it looked kind of goofy. And then one day, those upswept quillins and on the crossguard, one half of them broke off. So the sword was all wonky and loose, and the pommel was crooked, and the crossguard was broken, and I was moving out. This was around, I think this would have been about 3.5 years ago, because around the time I was getting divorced and moving out and trying to figure out what am I taking, what am I getting rid of. And I'm looking at this busted up sword, and I'm just like, I've got other swords. I'm like, you know what, hell with it, chuck it, get rid of it. Now looking back, I kind of regret that, because it was the first sword I ever got, and I do kind of wish I still had it. But I'm not one for regrets. So in any case, that's kind of how I got into it. That was the first piece that I ever got. And yeah, the rest is history, I suppose. So what I'd like to do with these videos is walk through sort of a chronology of these weapons in my collection, some of the stories behind them, or where I got them, or how I came to acquire them, because some of them are mildly amusing. As I said, I was sharing some on Facebook when somebody suggested that I do this video. And as we progress into some of the stuff I've bought more recently, I may do some demonstrations and reviews of my impressions of them as functional tools. Now, I want to be very clear about something. I don't claim to be anything I'm not, and that's why I opened the video talking about 4 channels that are significantly better than mine will ever be at that exact thing: weapon demonstrations, reviews, etc. I'm not a HEMA practitioner. I'm not a trained martial artist. I'm not an academic. I've never written a paper or majored or gotten a degree in medieval studies, anything like that. I'm just a goofball who loves swords. So there's going to be a lot of just my own impressions and whatnot, and you know, some comparison. Now, I am an engineer by trade, so I will be talking a little bit about some of the physics behind some of these weapons if I find that particularly interesting, or if I find the design of the weapon to be particularly noteworthy. I will bring up some of that, but yeah, if somebody disagrees or thinks that I've got something wrong, I probably do. I don't claim to be as good as some of these other guys. And if what you want is really good, in-depth study of some of this stuff, go watch somebody else. If you want to hear me talk about my, some of the pieces in my collection and some of my relationship with swords and my interests, then by all means, whatever, like and subscribe or whatever, and hopefully, it'd be nice if you also are interested and have some stuff in your collection, you want to talk about it or whatever. You know what? Like to chit chat with folks about swords and the like. So anyway, there'll be a series of these. As I said, we're going to try to walk through these chronologically. The next one is going to be about four weapons actually that I acquired in Thailand. So I will see you then.